Hi there. I'm Dr. Kimberly Ernest, licensed psychologist and licensed professional counselor, as well as the executive vice president of Pennsylvania Counseling Services and the founder of Live Up Counseling. Today, we are here on the How to Be Happy Hour to discuss all of the different ways that we use the creative and expressive arts in the ways in which we heal from mental health and substance use disorders.
Hello, my name is Louis Bianco. I am a person with lived experience for 25 years. I've also served as a psychiatric nurse and a certified peer support specialist, and I now consider myself a mental wellness edutainer using arts and creativity to teach important mental wellness topics.
Hi, I'm Eiley Herr. I am a dual diagnosis therapist at Pennsylvania Counseling Services. Work a lot with folks with severe mental illness, homelessness, and addiction, and I'm also a licensed music therapist.
Hi, my name's Leah Miller. I am a licensed professional counselor at New Journey Family Center, and I do a lot of play therapy with children, and yeah, that's what I do.
I'm Don Porter. I'm a family-based therapist out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania with Pennsylvania Counseling Services, and I love art in every facet.
So you all are truly, I mean, I think I mentioned this before we got started, but y'all are the experts in the room here today. I love like creative things, but I think like the extent of my successful creativity has been like breeding the perfect egg carton. And chicken genetics isn't usually thought of as a form of creative expression, but that's probably how I express myself most creatively. Or somebody who uses it as a coping skill, but never has like a deep connection to the outcomes of what I create because it's never very good. So what do y'all think about this idea that we can heal through the creative and expressive arts? And have you noticed it being most effective in each of your unique perspectives and spheres?
I think I noticed when you were talking, you talked about the outcome not being good or not having necessarily an ability to do it. And what is amazing to me about music and art and movement is that the outcome doesn't matter. It's successful if you enjoyed doing it, even if you scrap the product at the very end.
I recently took a creative arts therapy class, and one of the things I talked with my professor about a lot was like being creative myself, wanting to have that experience of like making it be good. And so like as we were practicing and doing like the therapeutic like kind of lab work or whatever, it ended up that I was missing out on the therapeutic things. So I often wonder what it's like for like someone who is an artist who naturally like loves to do art to be able to be in the process rather than be like, oh, did I mix this blue right? Or like, did I EQ that? Just like, is that like the right noise for what I'm listening to? Or so like missing the idea of what it is about the art that slows you down enough to like be in it and to like feel it, and rather than like making sure you get the right thing at the end of the day.
I think I've learned a lot about creativity from children in play therapy, where they don't have an agenda on what it's going to look like at the end. And I do a lot of sand play where the kids put little toys in the sand, and that is their expressive language for sharing what's going on with them. And as they like put different toys in, they can scrap it or put it back in, and they maneuver them around. And it's just really cool to see the beauty of their play be creative and expressive, even though an adult might not be able to pinpoint, oh, this means X, Y, and Z. It means that they're figuring things out and they're being creative in that, and it doesn't matter what the end looks like.
I wonder where it is that we learn that we need to judge what we're doing, because you're right. Children they create, they're proud of it, and they'll even point out like, well, it doesn't look like that, but this is what it is. And somewhere along the way that gets drilled out of us, and how to get that back.
And kids also have that thing where they're like, look what I did. And no matter what it is at the end of it, they're like, I have this thing. And I think that like what gets pulled away from us is that like do you like it? Like as an adult, you're like, is this good enough? Does this meet your standard of thing? And when you're a kid, you have just the joy of like, I built this gross like mud pie, but look how cool it is. Like it's just dirty and
Mom, I found a cicada shell. And I was like, oh, yay.
look, it clings onto my coat. Yeah, absolutely.
Or when they've dug a hole and you say, why did you dig a hole? Because I was digging a hole.
Right.
Obviously.
Just to enjoy, there doesn't have to be a reason.
Yeah.
I do think there is an innate desire or excitement to share, for all creatures, even if you look at a dog, and that's not to be insulting, but the dog is excited to show you what they found. The cat is excited if they bring it to you. So I think that there's a natural desire to not just see it for yourself, but to share it with others. When it starts to get tainted and is it good enough to share, I don't have the answer to that. But the general concept of wanting to share our art or our creativity, I think, exists within a lot of us.
It's interesting you talk about, I can't remember who just said it, but this idea that they don't necessarily, they're not as tied to their outcomes. They find joy in the process and they do. But I can remember right around this time last year, really hard season for our family. My son was really struggling in school. We were dealing with a lot of bullying scenarios. And so probably this week, 1 year ago, I pulled my son out of public school to homeschool him, and fortunately found a new school. And I was a very short-term homeschool parent, and it was a great experience, but it was a lot for a full-time working family. Yeah. But during that season, I remember feeling really frustrated with him for the better chunk of last year. When he was creating or was drawing, he had really low distress tolerance, and he would get really mad over every little mistake, and he would like crumple it up and throw the paper, and he's like, this is stupid, everything's stupid, I hate everything. And I remember like just being with him and being like, buddy, this is the first time you ever drew that, and trying to do like a little cognitive therapy on my kid, like you do, as a therapist.
Like you do.
Like you do. Luckily I'm not, it's not like BF Skinner, it's not that bad, but
shocking him or nothing.
Nothing like that. But I remember like talking to my husband and being like, how can we support him in getting over this? And then we got him out of a really hard situation. We put him in a place where he could experience safety again. We created a context of healing and got some external supports where we needed to, and it went away on its own. Like on its own, that I'm horrible or whatever, like it all just kind of disappeared without any of us having to really intentionally address the issue. And now he's making whole books with his friends. He has a whole side hustle at school that we're not allowed to do and all kinds of different things. But like that confidence crept back in with his creativity when the noise in his life came back down again. But he was so tied to outcomes, I think, when he was in acute distress.
And that one kid who was like,
Yeah.
wasn't present anymore. And like, I can relate to some of that stuff of like the idea of like making sure that one person who's the most critical of you
Yeah.
is impressed by what you do. And like, I think that gets really tricky when the people who are most critical of ourselves are us. And that's like probably the biggest part of where that gets lost, right? Because if the kid wasn't there, like pointing the finger, like as soon as it was gone, he was okay and he was able to make it through. And yeah.
Oh, no, and I truthfully didn't realize that until this moment. Like, as we're sitting here talking, because one of you said, like, oh, kids don't have that. I was like, well, mine did, but he doesn't anymore. Huh. Oh. So thank you all for an aha moment here.
Yeah, and I think you can model with kids too. Like I had a session earlier this week actually where the kid was like trying to paint something like perfectly. So I just took my hand in the paint and I just started moving my hand all around in the paint, making it really messy. And she looked at me wide-eyed like, what on earth is going on here? And I made the messiest painting I've ever seen. And then she joined me and started like just doing whatever she wanted in the paint. And I think there was just like freeing moment for her where she could just do whatever she wanted. And I wasn't judging her. She wasn't judging her. She was just being a kid and being creative.
Which song is it? Which sister from Encanto? The one who gives up the perfectionist and just starts making the plants she wants to make?
Isabel or Isabella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it all ties into to this age-old argument of what makes an artist an artist. Is it the person that doesn't care about the outcome, that does it for themselves from whatever comes from within, or is it the person that has a specific product that they can replicate or create over and over again that is possibly quote unquote levels above what other people can do with the same medium? There's been arguments about that forever. Are you not an authentic artist if you care what people think? Are you only authentic if you don't? Is it only creative if you're outside of the lines? Is it restrictive if you're inside of the lines? So I think even conceptually, art and creativity, that many of us have our own opinions on what those words mean. Because I would probably be someone who would color inside the lines and experience distress if I got outside of the lines. But I also wouldn't consider myself a non-creative, or I never felt oppressed if I did color outside the lines and wanted to start over. If that turned into low self-esteem, then that could be an issue. But if it was my desire for my art to look the way I saw it in my mind's eye, it might be coloring inside the lines. So where do we define, some of those terms in general? I think a lot of it's relative.
And I think the therapy space is one of the places where you can explore music, art, dance without being judged. I think about my experiences. I went to a very prestigious music school at one point, and the level of competition just absolutely took the joy out of everything. And, things called juries at the end of the year where you are literally graded on your performance, having to give a senior recital that had to be at a certain level in order to be able to move through things. And so we have this thing that we love, and then we go to school for it, and there has to be a way to measure progress, but then we get graded on it. And we start seeing that, when do they start actually grading artwork? Like middle school, high school maybe? Is when you start getting grades rather than just, hey, thanks for participating.
It was middle school for people my age.
Right when kids' self-esteem is great.
At its maximum.
Prime and ready to go.
Let's take that coping skill right away.
Right.
That's interesting. As you were talking, Eiley, my doctorate was from University of North Texas, which is a famous jazz school. Like that's what they're known for, and it's a really cool place to go to school because you get to walk around. Like walking across campus, there'd be all these little music groups playing and whatever else, but also providing services in the mental health clinic there. I had a lot of musicians coming in and actively like really struggling with like some self-harm or some pretty high risk like suicidal thoughts, and a lot of it was based on we had a PhD in orchestral conducting, and I had a few students from that program on my caseload, and I remember one that was like just falling apart under the pressure, and when she went to her supervisor or her dissertation advisor, they essentially said like, shut up or get out. Like those are your two choices. And it was just mind blowing to me that like a music program is gonna go there with it. Like, and who does that serve? Like, is that, because that's not art anymore. That's torture. I don't know what it is, but it's not. How can you be creative under that level of duress?
And what's the intent of the art? What is the art for at that point, right? Like, because if you're so proficient that everybody sits back and is like, that guy can really play, it's different than when you watch somebody who loves to play.
Yeah.
Like there was a guy in the room next to me in college. He played classical guitar and he was really good. The kid had no soul. He was like the most non-soulful dude I've ever met. And he could play good. It sounded, he was playing the right notes, but it didn't feel like love. It didn't feel like the emotion of like dumping into something. And he was fun to play with, like to like learn from. But once it got past like learning, like his experience was like, well, I have to sit down and practice and I have to make sure that I got this and that. I'm like, do you ever play like AC/DC, man? Because that's a lot of fun. Like, that's a lot of fun. And he just wasn't there. And I think that, like, for him, he probably stopped playing when his classes were over. Like, he just stopped playing. And, like, for me, I can't, most rooms in my house have a guitar within 10 feet. And my family might not love it as much as I do, but I love the ability to pick up and just like play a 3-chord nothing and just being happy and finding the spot where it goes from even like the performance aspect of it is like there's so much pressure. Like I play in church sometimes and I put AC/DC in church. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna catch hell. But there's a certain level of pressure of like, oh, I want to make sure that like I'm in the right spot so the church can like be with me in this moment. And then it's like, oh, am I playing because like I want to be with these people and have this experience of like doing music and singing all together? Because that experience feels so much different than if I'm like, okay, don't screw up verse 2, don't screw up verse 2, don't screw up verse 2. And there is almost every time I play in that context where I have to lead, something goes very wrong, and I'm like, man, I'm glad we're all family and we're all okay, because if we're not doing this thing that we love together, then it's just like watching a guy do a thing. And I love going to concerts. I love watching a guy do a thing, but there's a different feeling when you see whoever is performing or leading a thing when you know they love it. And like, they got that stupid look on their face. It's a little bit glazed over, but they're in it, you know?
Who's the musician that you would say loves, because there's somebody in my head immediately as you were talking. I was thinking about, it's kind of an obscure, but Corey Wong and the Wong Notes, if you're familiar at all. Pitar, the drummer.
Yeah.
Like, he is just always like he's so fucking happy. And he's drumming, and he's happy, and it's infectious. And like the whole time I watch them perform, I'm watching Pitar because he is having the time of his life playing a song he's probably played 1,000 times.
I saw last summer. I saw Wheatus, the Teenage Dirtbag Band, and their drummer's the same way. Because like a lot of times the drummer's like, look at me hit hard, and like really like in it. But this dude is just like. And like he was just in love with the fact that he was playing, and like those guys only had that one song. They only had that one song, so I mean they play their set, and everybody's just like, all right, come on, get to the one we know. But there was joy. It just like radiated joy, and it was I definitely I can't think like you put me on a spot. Like who do you think?
Yeah, no, I just was curious.
And there are so many. Musicians that you see love it. Like I think Bono might be like that. I mean, it's kind of a like artsy, fartsy pull, but I think he loves singing, and he loves his causes or whatever. So that's like his like platform. But he's like 1,000,000 years old, and he is loving singing every night when he goes out. And I kind of see that with him a little bit.
You said someone came to your mind?
Freddie Mercury.
Ah.
Yeah.
Like that's all he knew how to do.
Yeah.
And that's why he was here.
That was his purpose, and he felt it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can't fake it. Like I think that you watch certain folks, like as their career progresses, you just see it kind of like it went from for the love of the show. Like there's a band that my husband and I have followed since they were playing like pizza places to huge arenas, and there was a moment where we looked at one another and we're like, we miss the pizza places. Like we miss that vibe because they're, I mean, and technically and from a talent perspective, exponential, right? But there was some of the heart that got lost along the way. And I often wonder, like, where'd the heart go? Like what happened?
I don't know that's, I mean, we are talking ultimately about mental health, and I don't know that that's not part of the gig sometimes. it's you have this gift, and it's possibly cliche, but you have this curse. So these people who are incredibly talented, again, just because they have that high standard for themselves, it doesn't mean that they're not also in love or immersed in what they're doing. It becomes compulsory. It can be better. I can do this differently, and almost it becomes an obsession. So it'll cause as much joy as it does distress. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not supposed to be doing it, in my opinion, or that they're doing it wrong. Me personally, it comes with the territory. I have a desire for a certain outcome, but I also have this nonstop desire to continue to create. And that creates a dichotomy sometimes where it both causes stress and also relief of stress. And that's why using it as a coping skill and talking to people and trying to educate them on how to have these things be coping skills, you have to realize that it can go from stress relief to stress inducing.
That's a fine line.
Yeah.
I have a degree in violence. Not that.
Violence.
Violence, yes.
Highly heard.
Where'd you go to school for that?
Violence. Yeah, can I go?
Degree in violin performance.
There it
That's
is.
my bachelor's, and it is literally a degree to starve. I was going to be a music teacher, and I had a teacher that turned me on to music therapy, so I switched majors. But so I have a degree in playing a violin a very certain way. You listen to recordings, you try to emulate those. Itzhak Perlman was always an idol of mine and someone I'd listen to and try to make it sound like that. And then I walked into my first graduate level music therapy class, and a whole bunch of instruments around that I'm familiar with from the time that I was going to be a music teacher. And it was basically, tell me how your day was, but don't use words. Show me. What? I've been playing the violin since I was 4. I can play scales. I can do all those things, but tell you how my day was. And that first just opening eyes, that difference between having a product that you're putting out there and just, there's absolutely no way I could mess this up unless I decide to chuck an instrument across the room. And even then, I know
one
some
way to
people who
Even
would
then, it's a good indicator, right?
The way to communicate.
yeah, and just that moment of oh, that is why we do music therapy. You can't, there's not a wrong way to answer that question. Someone's asked me how my day was. It's not one of those generic, how are you today, that no one really wants an answer. And they're going to listen to what I give back. And they may or may not understand the point that I was trying to get across, but that's okay.
And you'll re-experience it, and you'll be able to push through it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I feel like that impulsivity allows space for creativity that will release your inner child that needs to come out in that moment. The deep part of you that doesn't know how to communicate those things, and when you're impulsive to go and play or do whatever with no rule book or structure, you can just do it, and that's what needs to be expressed.
One of the things they teach you as a music educator is how to hand out instruments in a way that children will not play them. To leave them on the floor or to hold them with your arms crossed or something. Because kids and adults, regardless of if they tell you they can play or not play, if you put a shaker egg in their hands, they're just going to start messing with it.
For sure, yeah. That's great, though. Don't you, that's my favorite. Watching kids do that thing. You were saying before, how do you feel? And picking up an instrument and just kind of figuring that out. Some of the best times after terrible days of work is just going and turning my guitar up way too loud, making sure the neighbors can all hear how I'm feeling, and just an E minor, the darkest of all guitar chords. It's just, and there's something of just the all that whatever is pent up can all just go out, just in 2 or 3 minutes of just angry guitar, and it's you can go and do that for a couple minutes and put the guitar down and shut the amp off and walk in and be okay, now I can do whatever it is I need to do. And the working through that process is the part where I think that the magical stuff happens. I did a project on paper mache masks for PTSD guys who were in Afghanistan and stuff. And the one dude had this image of his friend's face kind of got messed up pretty bad, and he would wake up and just see his friend's bloody face constantly, and so he made this mask of his friend's horrified face, and he would work on it in therapy with the therapist and go through it, and they'd talk about it, and then he had the box that he would put it in every week, and then he would take it home some weeks, and eventually he was like, how did he say it? It was like, I don't need him anymore. Because he had stopped seeing the guy in his dreams. He had stopped, but it was the act of like identifying like this is the thing that is like plagues my day, like my nights, and going through the process of like identifying what the thing really is, and the fact that he missed his friend and that his last image of his friend was this horrible thing, but then being able to be like, this was a thing that happened, and it's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I miss my friend, but being able to connect his friend and separate it from this thing that he saw. And like the arts in that way feels like the strum of an E minor. It's that thing that like getting through that moment of complete and total distress, and then identifying it as, this is a thing that's happening. This is this, and this is this, and I need to move through it. Like you talked about coping,
Right.
like that's how coping works. Like I hear people say, this is a thing I've been saying too much, so I apologize already. But there's this thing that people, like whenever I work with kids who've had an experience in care, they're like, oh, coping skill, coping skill. I'm like, what's your coping skill? And they're like, oh, I can take a deep breath, I can draw a picture. But I'm like, I've had to rethink of like what that means. And I'm like, so when something's hard, what do you do to get through it? Because like a coping skill is like a buzzword that's really out there. So kids can identify all these things that are the coping, but if it's not identified as what you do to get through instead of this thing you do to avoid. And it's the getting through that feels like that's the work, right? And so like if they're able to identify their art, or like we're talking about today, as their coping skill, then it needs to be the thing that gets them to be able to handle the stress of whatever that thing is, rather than the way to avoid it.
And when it comes to kids and music, they're so frequently told that their coping skill is wrong. It's been a long time since I did family-based, but I remember families being worried about their kids listening to death metal or something. And I'm like, you know that's not causing your children's mental health issues, right? I mean, admittedly, I'm a believer in digital and musical diets. You know, what we take in definitely influences what comes out. But if your kid is angry and listening to angry music and you tell them that's wrong, now what?
Yeah.
So then they go back to, my coping skill is breathing, and adults tell me to use coping skills, and they don't work.
And they're never going to do
Yeah,
it.
and they're like, didn't work.
Oh yeah, you can tell a kid when they've been told to take a deep breath, they look at you and go, I breathed.
Yeah, for sure.
That
You know.
translates into adulthood as well, though. As someone with bipolar who is also a creative, I can't tell you how many times getting into a creative space that it was a warning sign that there was a manic episode approaching. I speak at a lot of colleges, and I was recently at a college speaking to nursing students about living with bipolar, and I was standing outside of the classroom, and the professor was describing symptoms, and he said, you might see someone who starts being overly creative and writing lots of books, and I'm listening to all this as someone who wrote 3 books in 3 years. And so when I walked in and talked to them, I introduced myself and I said, I've written 3 books, and if you're a writer, that's actually not a symptom of mania. It just means you're a writer. And everybody, including the professor, kind of laughed, because it's true. There are so many people who are creatives where if they find a way to be quote unquote successful at it, there's no concern that they have any mood disorders. In fact, they're just really talented creatives.
Yep.
Yet if you have a label, and you are doing something at a feverish pace or with a level of intensity and commitment, and you have that label of something like bipolar, it's a concern. So even in the adult realm, creativity and certain levels of a desire to create in general is also frowned upon, not just at the child level. I still experience it.
How many books a year does Stephen King put out?
Yeah.
Well, he's right. And is he manic? Are they manic behaviors?
Possibly.
Possibly.
I mean,
They're great books,
Is he
but
getting
possibly.
appropriate sleep? Is he working through the night? All these
When
things.
you read them, there are some mental health themes present.
course.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
But you develop this level of success at it where that is, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, you're all of a sudden you're prolific. You're not manic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's a really difficult thing for people with mental health diagnoses, especially something like bipolar,
Yeah.
where you can't just be an avid creative without it being a warning sign. But if you make enough money, it's not a warning sign at all. It's
Right.
just your quirk. It's just your process.
And it's measurable in a sense, and I feel like coping skills have to be like measurable, because when you're describing what is going on in therapy, if you say, well, they said this, and this, that's describing something. But if I'm like, oh, well, they played in the sand for an hour and they dealt with something, but there's no descriptive words for that. Like, it's just a beautiful process. And how do you explain that to somebody? Like, how you healed just being creative, just doing something.
I think it goes back to what you were kind of discussing, which is this idea of like it's the path through. And I don't play any instruments. I tried to play the saxophone as a kid, but I grew up with an autistic brother who probably horns and autism. Like if there are two
Noises.
things that really don't go together, it was that.
Yeah.
But I did my best. I learned how to play Ghostbusters. That's about the extent of it. We still have that saxophone, so my kids mess around on it now. But I use music often to come into touch with something that my higher order thinking is holding at arm's length. So there are times where there's specific songs, specific music that when I'm angry and there are times where I'm going into a difficult situation. I'm like, all right, let's put on some Rage Against the Machine on the drive because I'm about to go meet with such and such decision maker and I need to bring my rage from here down to here. So let's get a little bit of it out and then go in and be Dr. Ernest and get this shit done.
Right.
Or there are just tough day yesterday, just hard shit, one after the other in workplace setting. And so for me, Megan Thee Stallion's Bad Bitches Have Bad Days Too, favorite song, on those bad days that I'm giving too much power to. So it's not that I don't need to wallow. I don't need to cope. I need to see it. I need to acknowledge it. And then for me, a good beat and kind of dance my way through it or move through it and let that energy out in a different way. But I think it's that coming into contact with something, allowing it to just be, and then your psychological immune system kicks in and sorts it out for you.
Yeah.
If you give yourself space, you're amazingly resilient. And so give yourself space and then all the space and you figure it out when you create room.
And that's creative. I'm just imagining you dancing around a room, your body's moving and you're not really.
Oh, I'm always outside too. My
Yeah.
neighbors think I'm fucking nuts.
Wherever you
I'm
are.
sure they're what is she doing?
Yeah, but your body's dictating that.
Yeah.
Your mind is no longer in control. So it's creative to move. It's creative to write. It's creative to sing. Whatever you're doing, it's your body is doing it for you.
Music therapy has a word for that I've never heard described in other realms of therapy called the ISO principle. The ISO principle is the idea that you meet the client where they're at, either emotionally or physically. So in a hospital setting, if you have a person who's breathing too fast, you might work with them and start with a song that has a really fast tempo. And then you gradually either slow that tempo down or move into slower, calmer songs, and you don't have to talk about the process. The body just follows. Same emotionally. So sometimes it's literally getting it out of your system, or other times it's listening to something angry, and then people often move on to something kind of regulating themselves. And I think we do that constantly in play therapy and stuff. We just don't have a word for it.
Yeah, because they do it in the play. Like, there's no language for it. They're playing something out in a dollhouse or playing something out in the sand, and they get it out, and it's there. And I wish I could come up with a word for it, but that probably fits the best, where it's just like, okay, whatever this thing is in the space here, and the child is doing whatever said thing they need to do with whatever that is, and it goes away.
I don't work with kids very much in my practice anymore because I have a kid and I discovered I can either have patience for my child or everybody else's children. But when I did work with kids, I remember having a couple of times when we were doing some play therapy and the kid would be acting something out and they would just stop. And you could tell there's like this judgment point where they're going to either share something or they're worried about that. And I was curious about, like, when you see a kid get stuck like that, is that like an encouragement point or is that a give them space point? Do you know those moments I'm talking about?
Yeah, I feel like it could go either way, where I don't know, I usually let the child guide in that moment. Like, what do they need? And like, if they've invited me into their play, I will encourage it along, versus if it's something they're doing solo, I just kind of allow it to be, and whatever they need to do in that moment is what they need to do. Or sometimes they'll invite you into like their hesitation. Like, there's a toy in my office that I have a child that is very afraid of, and every time he sees it, he's like, that can't be there. He stops, and I'm waiting for the moment when that toy is invited into our play, because I know it will be once he's comfortable with its presence in my office, right? So I don't know.
I think that's also a great moment for like I know what you do, you kind of let him direct, but I think about like those are the moments where I'm just like, wow, dude, you just did this thing. Like, what happened for you just now?
Yeah.
And I know you do that, of course, but like in the moment for the kid, like where did that hesitation come from? Like, are you afraid I'm thinking something of you? Are you thinking about like the outcome of your, like, however this plays out? Like, kids are awesome.
They're really cool.
Are you about to spill a family secret?
Right.
Right.
I'm also learning about synergetic play therapy, which is where you co-regulate with them in the room. So if they're like demonstrating some level of distress, what can I do with my body to show them that I'm regulating and model regulating to them, and maybe that will help them get through said moment.
That's like the tempo of the music thing, right?
Yeah.
Like meeting them where they're at and like bringing them to a place where they can regulate.
It's thinking about if you go to a doctor's office and you're really upset about a symptom and a doctor's like, oh, it's not even a big deal, it's going to be fine. And they're trying to make you feel better, but instead they completely invalidate everything that you just said. Instead of being, you also don't want them to panic. But this is
That is awful. Like, I don't know which would be worse, you know?
Like,
hey,
I'm
this
sorry
is
you're
really
dying.
distressing to you. We're going to figure it out. Like, we're going to move towards something. And I think that's we're doing a nonverbal way of validating the feeling and the expression. And we keep going back to kids, but addicts, folks with mental health issues, where they're constantly being told that what they're doing is wrong or illegal or getting locked up for it, just to tell them to stop or it's going to be okay. They're going to look at you like you're the one who's crazy, and okay, let's meet you where you are. This does suck. I think the first time I ever did a DUI evaluation with a guy who came in a biker jacket, and he's all tough and this is bullshit, it's a waste of my time, da-da-da. And I was baby therapist, and I looked and said, all right, so I won't waste your time. You don't waste my time. Let's get the fucking probation officer off your back. Just get this done. Cooperate with me. All right. And then we got through it.
Yeah.
No, I think that brings me to this idea of like the storytelling. And I feel like so much of my work therapeutically is designed to support the individual in developing a cohesive narrative of their story. And so often it's like trauma-based narratives, because I feel like trauma just takes that higher order functioning offline so often. And so trauma narratives come out in like spurts and spats. Like you just hear pieces of their story, but maybe it's disjointed for different reasons, or it's completely divorced from emotion words, or it's only physical sensations or images. But I think like the story isn't cohesive. And so I think your brain gets stuck on pieces of it, like the example you used of that client, which was the image of his friend. And so often the work that I'm doing is designed to help them tell their story, write their story. I think there's a lot of power in just writing down your story, looking at the parts of your story that maybe you ignored, and helping those pieces of the story become more integrative. And even when I don't work with kids either, because same thing. I can tolerate my kids or I can tolerate other people's kids, and so I've chosen my kids for this season. But so often I'm working with people who had childhood trauma. And so I'm working with an adult brain that's navigating a child's memory. And sort of how do we take the things you know now and pull them into that memory? Like, well, I should have fought him off. And it's like, well, tell me more about how a 6-year-old fights off a full grown man. Like, help me understand that piece. And like slowly integrating the things that you know up here, but you fail to ever integrate down here, and like that ever widening like chasm between your head and your heart, and helping start to pull threads between the two.
At the very beginning of the pandemic, when everything shut down and everyone was so worried, and I was trying to work from home and manage my son, who was, I want to say 6 at the time. I went to check on him, and he was playing Lego Worlds. When there's a lot of creativity in video games now too, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, "I'm building hospitals. There aren't enough hospitals, and that's what I heard them say on the news. And I'm building hospitals." And it was that moment, like, I know he can't build a hospital. He knows he's not really building a hospital, but his way of trying to work through all this big stuff that he's hearing when the adults around him don't know what's going to happen next. And it was just that moment that kids naturally just kind of act out in their play, and it was amazing to see. It led to a really good conversation and stuff, but that moment always sticks with me.
The storytelling, as I think that it's a very powerful tool. So I've been going through therapy for 25 years now. This all started when I was 15. I'm 40 years old. But I did realize that you can learn to tell your story from when it started, but there's actually a really cool creativity part in the creation of your story as far as what life can or will look like moving forward. Because the one thing I learned is, even with a pretty solid understanding of why did my life end up the way my life has ended up, that did not generate a solution of kind of how to move forward. So when you look at like hope is a pillar of recovery, hope at its core is creative, because it's often you're in this space where you see nothing but negativity, and you are to believe that there is some sort of positive outcome on the other side of this darkness. So when you look at things like belief and hope, they are actually creative at their core. So it's not, it wouldn't just be the storytelling, it's also story creating, because there were just so many years where I had to believe life would be different than it was on a daily basis. Years. And so you don't just want to become hyper-focused on solely figuring out every fact and filling in every blank of how I got here. There's something empowering and ultimately creative on where can I go? What can I do next? And how can I get there? And then you can manifest that, similar to a project, similar to art, where you figure out ways and materials and everything you would do to try to finish the story. Yeah, so you're not just telling it or recollecting it, you're also writing it.
And that's lyrics for songs too. I'm thinking I can't remember the name of the blog, so I can't give credit to the author off the top of my head. I'll look it up later. But it's a music therapist who is writing about how with teenagers she will take the Alanis Morissette song "One Hand in My Pocket," where it starts with can't remember the lyrics right now. I'm something, but I'm also
happy.
something. I'm
Broke, but I'm happy.
I'm broke, but I'm happy. Yeah,
Here, but I'm really gone.
exactly. See, I can't remember.
Yeah. There we go. Let's just
And then
So good.
have them write something. Okay, first you have a list of the things that are not going right, and then here's a list of the other things that you have. And so that moment when you were talking about trying to create hope out of nothing, here you are. You've got this structure of a song, and all you have to do is take out this word and put in that word, and now a person's telling their story, and a lot more than what is going wrong and what is going right, the standard questions that we always ask people. It makes it more accessible. Also very much dates me, because if I were to tell I have a 16-year-old client later today, and I think if I told her that I wanted to do an Alanis Morissette song with her, she would look at me like I was...
That would be musical education.
Right.
It's a TikTok sound, though.
It's a-
So,
Oh, is it?
yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
album.
it's,
take songs.
it's a TikTok sound. So I'm broke, but I'm happy.
Okay.
She'll relate.
Or
to
you
it.
could just hit the 40-year-olds. I'd be okay too.
I do say I love TikTok for the fact that it is I don't really love TikTok, but TikTok has brought back some of these songs.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's empowerment there as well, though. Like, I've often used that metaphor of, like, especially, I mean, most of my work is trauma work. I don't know. I mean, I feel like most of us in the helping professions, we have to do some level of trauma work. And frequently, like, I'll use the metaphor of, like mom, dad, grandma, whoever it was, had the pen for like that season of your life. And here at 28, 30, 40, whatever, wherever you are today, like the pen is in your hand, but yet you're still allowing them to write the story. And so like you're the author now. And yeah, that sucks. And that was awful. And it should have never happened to you. And it did. And so how do we develop a sense of acceptance for the parts of our story that we'd rewrite if we could, but like, unless one of y'all have a time machine, I mean, Doctor Who's not real, but if he was, I'd be the first one in the fucking TARDIS. But like that's not one of the choices. So barring that, today you've got the pen, and how will 20 years from now, this next season of your story be written? And I found that so often I've had clients get almost frustrated with me in that. They're like, what do you know? Like, this all happened to me, and it's like, but that doesn't need to define you. Like, you define you today. And so how can I help you see your own power that you have in telling your story and what comes next?
Kim, I do a similar thing, only like I tell kids, like, especially if a kid's right in the middle of it, like, imagine yourself in the future goes back to now. What would that guy tell you to help you be okay? And like, they're able to separate the idea of like their successful self from where they're at right in the moment where they're struggling, and they can identify things really clearly when they just pull back from being in it. And because being in it is where they're like spiraling and feeling out of control. And old guy version of that kid is like, hey man, you're going to be okay. And some kids really take solace in that. It's surprising because it's a Marty McFly trick, really. And there's nothing more complicated than that. But it's amazing how like when kids are able to see that even their own future could be hopeful where they're at in the moment. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
I would say the one pushback, and not pushback towards
Do it,
towards
man. I
anyone
love it.
here.
Yeah.
It's not a pushback, but it's the general concept of even if you're telling someone to write their story, which is what I just said, you're talking to someone who was in a difficult situation that they did not put themselves in. So in a growing society where we have an expectation of fair. It's not fair.
No.
It's not fair to ask the person who is suffering the most to put in most likely the most work.
Yeah.
But that is the general way that recovery works. It's what saved my life. But when you're working, especially with youth, how do you explain that concept? Hey, I know this isn't your fault. You didn't put yourself here, but here's this hill that we need you to climb. It's a really hard sell.
Yeah.
Logically.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, I'm so grateful for creativity, because it exists within the quote unquote illogical.
Right.
I can grasp that this isn't my fault and it's my responsibility to fix. But that is a really hard sell when you look at what fair and balanced is. It would be like someone leaving a mess and then you being asked to clean it up and none of the mess is yours. You're not taught that as a child. You're taught just don't make the mess, but you shouldn't have to clean up somebody else's mess. But oftentimes that's what recovery asks of us. So it's just difficult to I think it's what you were saying about, yes, that's what was. Imagine what is. Even that, it's hard to leave what was, but because we can stay there and say, yeah, but I didn't do any of this. I didn't deserve any of this. I didn't ask for any of this. It wasn't because of my choices. So I'm not saying it's easy to stay there, but it's hard to ask someone to
It's
leave
hard to
there.
imagine alternative, though.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're in it, it's hard to face that mountain.
Right. Why should I? I
Yeah.
didn't do this. Why do I have to climb the mountain?
As you're talking, I actually had a client kind of come back at me using that metaphor. And this was a client, I mean, truthfully, that had like so many levels of like social determinants of health, like poverty. He was Black, addiction in his family system, a significantly disabled caregiver, like all these different factors kind of stacked against him. And I remember him saying like, yeah, but you're asking me to write my story in crayon. And I don't have the tools, or like you're telling me I need to write my story in blood, but you're not giving me a pencil. And I was like, man, that's a really deep way to kind of pivot this metaphor. And at the end of the day, whether you write your story in crayon, blood, or feces smeared on the wall, I mean, I don't know how you want to do it, but ultimately, I can't, in my care for my clients, ever co-sign the notion that they are helpless in their scenario, right? You know what I mean? While also being really mindful that I don't want to invalidate them and send the message that I believe that they're capable of more than what they know that they're capable. But that's a push me, pull you, right? That's a balance all the time to say like, yeah, man, you've got all these factors. That's all real. And do you want to go back to jail?
Yeah, yeah.
Because so far I'm hearing that's not ideal either. So
I say in a really dark place, you need a really bright light. So for me, it was this massive creative undertaking that I am now seeing possibly come to fruition 10 years later. But it's just conceptually, it has to be a pretty bright light if you are shrouded in darkness. It can't just be you'll go get a part-time job. Like that's not going to be enough for someone to necessarily, and that's why you run the risk of, especially people who are in desperate spaces, of these desires to be grand, and their coping skill is going to make them famous, or their coping skill is going to give them tons of money, and we get stuck in some of those traps where I'm not just going to use this to cope, I'm going to use this to get completely out of the hole. And that it's a long process, whether you're talented or not. It's just a really long process to be a professional artist in general. So you look at all of those things, but conceptually you need something really big to believe in that's out there to believe it's worth the effort to put forth, even if you are unhappy with being surrounded by darkness. It has to be a bright light to see it.
This might be a bigger question than we were going to tackle today, but I was thinking when you talked about creativity and bipolar disorder, having been to a music school, having most of my friends be artists, one of the arguments I hear all the time is, I don't take my meds because when I take my meds, I can't be creative.
Sure.
And what happened when, how do we help someone get well when there's that part of their illness that is just like, I want to move toward that, or are we trying to medicate them out of being themselves? And I know that we don't give medications, but we're the ones they come to talk through those stressors. And that's a really big hurdle for a lot of folks.
I could say with personal pride that I've always taken my meds, even if they have dulled or dimmed or been a wet blanket on what I would call my creative light. And I was at a period of time where I was either going to finish my first album and produce it or become a certified peer support specialist. And I chose to be a peer support specialist and spend the rest of my money on that. I went to school to get my nursing degree after dropping out 3 times. I already wanted to be an artist. I've wanted to be an artist my whole life. That's what I want to do. That's why I believe I'm here. But I made some of these decisions that went against that. Things like taking my meds as prescribed, things like making sure to get a couple letters behind my name if possible, because it was never not put in front of me what reality was. And in some ways that would upset me, but in other ways I think it saved my life. So there was just make sure you have a safety net. You know, that was something that was never unspoken in my home. Lots of people are talented. That was another thing that was said out loud. And I'm grateful for the choices I made, but there were times where I sacrificed my authentic creative self to try to continue along my recovery journey.
And then what does creativity look like in just like a day-to-day life? Like while you are a peer specialist or a like certified nurse, like what does it look like for you to be creative just when you're doing what you're doing to survive life? Like I was thinking about your chicken genetics. Like you're just out here living your best life,
With my chicken.
but it's creative in
It is
some way. So like how do you incorporate creativity in life?
I think life is massively improv. At least for me at this point, the number one way I utilize it is you show up to all of these situations. I wake up suffering, tormented. I carry a burden every day for the rest of my life, and I still arrive places with a smile on my face, and I put smiles on other people's faces, and it's not going anywhere with a preconceived idea of what that day is going to be like. So you show up and you're mindful. And in many ways, being mindful is creative because you are adapting and adjusting at almost a second or minute basis. And that in and of itself is creative because you're not following a blueprint. You're literally following what's happening in front of you. So in that way, I would say more than anything, the ability to improvise would be how I use creativity personally on a daily basis.
I think it's also like, I mean, for me, it's this idea that like every tool is a weapon when you hold it right. And like when you pause, I mean, I think obviously storytelling and chicken genetics are my 2 creative outlets. And even when I'm headed into a meeting with non-creative types that like so often I'm the lone clinician in a room full of administrators. And so like I'm met with all the reasons why we need to get something done. And it's my role in all of that to kind of say like, all right, and how can we creatively, one, how can I help this side of the line understand this side of the line? And then also, how can I creatively create a shared experience in the room? And I'm not ashamed to admit, like if I'm meeting with legislators that I know have way more control over my life and the lives of my providers, I am there very intentionally seeking to manipulate their emotions and not in a nasty, but like, I want you to feel it. I know you think it. I want you to feel it. And I want you to know that your legislation, that it's well-intentioned, but it's a well-intentioned mistake. And here's why. Let's come into contact with the why. And I think some of that for me has been slowing down, allowing myself to notice my own experiences along the way, and allowing myself to attend to like those little moments of like creative, because I don't think many people would be like, oh, well, a documentation meeting, is that like one of your creative outlets? And it's like, truthfully, that's where I'm my most creative. But it's different. It's almost like marketing creativity, I guess, if I were to put words to it. Branding.
Yeah, but it's also creating again, advertising, right? It's
Yeah.
creating the human experience. Like there's opportunities to walk into therapy and be very professional and like have everybody think you're good at it and say all the right words, or you can have a human experience with somebody and even like some people argue about the professionalness of it, but the empathetic emotion that's right there in the room with you to talk about and be like, I'm feeling that as much as you're saying that. And that level of connection is like, I imagine, is what you're trying to create with the legislators or legislators.
Yeah.
And having that moment be like, do you understand why this is important? This is not just like a line item in your budget. This is important for like people are going to live because of this. And even if it's a documentation thing.
But if you can't make it sticky, it doesn't. So you have to find a way to get the message across. And I think it's like, truthfully, one of the most fun challenges in my job. Like, it's not fun, but I have fun with it because there are moments where it's like, well, this is a pickle. How can we figure this? Like, these people don't want to hear what I have to say.
Right.
I have 20 minutes with them. How do I make it the stickiest and get the biggest bang for our buck? And I don't know. It's something that's always kind
Creative
of
problem solving.
creative problem solving.
I like that idea of something being sticky. We were talking earlier about the TED Talk, Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator. How many times I have talked to clients about procrastination, and I love talking about it because I am an expert level procrastinator. And yeah, we won't go into that. Anyway, but that video sticks with people because it's funny and it's creative and it hits some very real topics in a funny way that people can relate to. And so that ability to express yourself creatively, get your point across, and then have people remember it. Because I can't tell you how many people have talked to me about procrastination, but that guy's message has stuck with me. And I can see he talks about something called Little Panic Monster, and he silly little cartoon drawing of the panic monster making you get something done. I can picture that panic monster in my head, like, all right, I can't wait for him to pop out. I got to get my stuff done. So a creative message can really stick with you in a way that just, you should do your paperwork, doesn't.
I also believe we're living in an age where creativity is becoming more and more necessary. When I talked about being an edutainer, I don't think it's ever been more necessary with adults or children than it is right now. This message could be incredibly important. This information could save your life. But if I'm not juggling on a unicycle while singing it at 80 beats per minute with my guitar, then you're not going to listen after the first minute of me talking about it. And, you know, given our current climate, at least on the mental wellness level, a lot of this stuff, although it's somewhat threatening and may have us dive deeper into ourselves than we're comfortable, and, you know, I believe in pacing and all of that, it's really important right now. So the fact that people have to figure out ways to creatively package it in order to possibly give you life-saving or life-improving information is also a sign of the times. Whether you're talking to legislators or, you know, you're not talking to the classroom, you're talking to the teachers. You have to do that stuff because everyone, I don't want to say everyone, that's an extreme, but we're losing our attention span. So we need it to be sticky. Even if it's really important, which there were times when this will save your life was sticky.
That used to capture people's attention.
Sticky enough, yes.
No, it's funny though because most of my professional-based trainings are in the areas of trauma, problematic sexual behaviors, all kinds of different, very unfunny topics. But one of my favorite coping skills is humor. Like, I think if we can't laugh at the absurdity, and I'm not saying like I laugh at my clients, but I will laugh with my clients. If they're laughing, I'm laughing. And to laugh at the absurdity of the human experience at times, I think there's power in that. For me, I've worked in community mental health now for 20 years. I know that burns out a lot of people. For me, it energizes me. I feel like I thrive in that context. And part of it has been the humor, sometimes very dark humor behind closed doors. And I can tell you, probably the greatest criticisms I get on some of my training feedback is surrounding that, like, you're making fun of a topic that isn't funny. Child sex abuse cannot be funny. And it's like, no one said child sex abuse is funny, but I believe when we're talking about it, we need to create space for laughter. Because here's the thing, you can have that as a part of your story and have laughter and joy and creativity and fun and improv. Like, all of this can also be there too. And if we as providers don't bring that into a conversation, I think we're creating an environment where people don't feel free to allow the range of experiences
yeah.
into if it's, oh, well, I've had this part of my story that's really painful, I must be sad always, or else it must not be painful, or if I'm
No person is one thing.
no, and
Yeah,
we don't
so
create space for
multifaceted.
it.
Yeah, exactly. My wife and I worked in foster care group home stuff for a long time, and some of the kids' stories, like, even some of the kids' stories are so heartbreaking and so devastating that if you don't say something really dark, you would just cry all the time. And the dark humor is one of the it's not, I was going to say safest, but it's a way to let the air out of the tire a little bit so the pressure doesn't explode, so you're not stuck in the moment where it's just like emotional bloodletting. So like, I appreciate that about you. Your trainings, Kim, I really enjoy, because they are like, yeah, this thing happened, it's horrible, but here's a kind of funny thing, but also this is serious, and we got to really talk about it. But it lets the air out of the room so people can take a breath.
Yeah.
Because otherwise everybody's like on the edge, or just emotions are gonna just rip them up, and it's hard.
It's brain chemistry too. If you think about, if we want to root all this in science, dopamine as being an anchor. You have a brain spike of something, you do something that causes a spike of dopamine, and your brain says, that was good, you should do it again. If we have people laughing and being creative and enjoying themselves in therapy, they're going to want to come back and do the hard stuff. But if all we do is dwell, IOP, 3-hour group, trying to get people to sit through a 3-hour group, we broke it up with a lot of laughter. There was a lot of heavy stuff because these guys are going through a lot. 3 hours of therapy 3 times a week is a lot of therapy. But those moments where we laughed and had fun and watched a Simpsons clip because it actually perfectly encapsulated that moment that we were talking about, that gets people wanting to come back. Why would people keep going to therapy if it felt horrible all the time?
It's funny. I've worked with certain clients that have expectations about therapy, right? One of the big ones that I hear often is, well, if I come to therapy, I will leave feeling better. And if I don't leave the therapy room feeling better, then you've not done your job, or whatever that is. And I have one client in particular, like right now, that I've been seeing forever. And it's one of those stories. It's like, holy shit, like just so much resiliency that it's like I could get weepy even talking about. Like, this woman's story is so powerful and so incredible. And like, if that was my story, I don't know that I'd be anywhere near where she is today. And so we've done a lot. Like, we've done DBT, we did a full CPT protocol, we did EMDR, like we've done every evidence-based practice. And she brought something into therapy last week, and I don't know what kind of mood I was in. I was just like, wow, that's fucked up. And like, she's weeping, and she's like, it really is fucked up. I was like, it is fucked up. Like, let's just sit, and that's fucked up. And it, like, to just validate that and make that real. And then we're laughing because she's like, because she's dropped out of every therapist she's ever had. She's seen me for 4 years. She's like, that's why I keep seeing you, because you say the F word when I need to hear it. But it's that idea that, like, so often we don't let we let the darkness be all consuming, and we fail to recognize that if you turn on even a little light, like sometimes a bright light is necessary, but you got like a little mag light in the moment, like start there, see what you can shine that on, see where you can grow it. But we get sometimes so defined by our darkness. There's a really old book. They don't even publish anymore. It's just a bummer because it's an incredible book, but it's called How to Make Yourself Completely Miserable. And it's written by somebody struggling with depression who the whole story is about how to make yourself more depressed if you want to be depressed. And so it's like isolate yourself from people that you love, listen to sad music, like watch Lifetime like TV shows. I don't know, all kinds of different things. But it's all about how if we wish to perpetuate towards one direction, we can do that, or we can recognize that we're capable of multiple experiences simultaneously and create space for all of it.
I think so. So that's a great segue back to art as coping, and I think it brings in, for as much as we talk about the importance of awareness, that book is probably a great look into a depressed mind. However, the people who didn't write it or don't exist in that space may get through 2 or 3 pages and be like, this is way too heavy. I'm not going to finish it. I wrote a book called Love, Fear, which is basically 2 books in one. It's 52 chapters of fear speaking to people personified, and it's 52 chapters of love. And it's basically my daily existence. It's everything I was taught I needed to pay attention to and be worried about as someone with bipolar. And then it's also all of the acceptance and everything's going to be fine. And it's both. I can't tell you how many people can't even get through the first few chapters of fear because it's,
Me.
oh, okay.
I switched. I actually talked to your wife. I said,
Okay.
it's really good, but by the end of, because I read at night.
Right.
I said, by the end of the day, I get stuck. And she goes, start the second half first.
Yes.
And so that's how I read it. then.
Right.
I went and I read love first, and then I could tolerate fear.
Right.
I needed.
But
I needed
conceptually,
love first.
if that's the brain of someone with bipolar who's gone through 25 years of therapy, and we're actually wanting to generate awareness of what these things are really like, and you start to peek through, or the mask that you were describing, someone looks at that and says, whoa, ew, or whatever they might think, then do we really want awareness? Or do we want awareness at the superficial level or whatever level we're actually comfortable with? Because awareness actually exists in those places that are difficult to exist. That's how people who don't experience those things can experience them to a degree. So when we start pushing them away, are we looking for awareness, or do we just want to hear that success story? Do we just want to get to the parts that make us feel better about ourselves, feel better about our children, feel more hopeful? I'm not saying it's an appropriate practice to always be miserable, but books like that, that's where awareness exists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a believer that video games are art and creativity.
Sure.
I'm losing my life to Final Fantasy Rebirth right now,
Oh,
which
yes.
is like my childhood revisited. I love it. Anyway, one of my favorite games is called Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and the artists and the creators of that game worked with a support group for people who hear voices, because the main character has both trauma and implied schizophrenia. And the whole way through the game, you're hearing voices. And some of them are the voices of persecution and telling you that you can't do it. And other ones are ones trying to encourage you. And sometimes they point you in the right way and sometimes the wrong way. And the creators of the game actually suggest you wear headphones when you play. I had to take them off.
Sure.
Because they actually do surround sound. And for a moment, I just had this glimpse, like, here is this thing that's supposed to be entertainment. And I know a lot of people stopped playing this game because of this. It is a little dark, to say the least. That moment of like, I can't focus on this game. And these voices are about the game. And I can't do this. And it was just like this aha, like, it's one thing to hear about hearing voices. And that's the closest I think I will ever come to experiencing what that is like. And art form was able to do that for me and give me that insight. And it was done with people with schizophrenia as opposed to, this is my guess as to what it's like.
Nothing about us without us.
Exactly. There's a really good, there's a documentary on how the support group and how they made this game. It's really interesting.
Very cool.
It's like something that you said earlier also was like, it's like the acceptable answer to how are you is I'm fine.
Right.
You know, it's the palatable level of like what people can tolerate. And in college, a friend and I were solving the world's problems and sitting around having coffee, and he said to me, he's like, what if we just told everybody how we were? And I was like, okay, man, you go first. I was like,
I'll see how that goes for
Yeah,
you.
right. I was like, I'll watch and tell you how it looks. And the idea of like, yeah, I'm really going through it. Do you want to talk about it or do you want to keep walking?
Yeah.
Because where's the, like, how much do you want to know about where I actually am versus like you being okay a foot and a half away and
Right.
on the other side of the room?
Or do you want to know? Or do you just want to go through the pleasantries of,
Yeah. Or are you
"How
polite?"
you?" Right. Which is, it's not an insult, but do we really want to know how someone is when we ask them?
I had a client call me on that about 2 weeks ago, and it still is a little bit strong. Client I've been working with for a long time, and we sat down in my office, and she said, "This is the space that I'm supposed to be allowed to be honest about how I'm feeling, and yet you ask me how I'm doing in the lobby."
Ooh.
Yikes.
I was like, wow. Like, I didn't even realize, like, "Hey, how you doing?" Didn't even realize I was saying it. It's just that ingrained in us.
Yeah.
And to realize these create a safe space where this client was able to say to me, "You are hurting this process," and to be able to hear that. So that's been very much on my heart lately. And every time I say, "How are you?" start counting. You won't believe how many times a day you say it. And we're therapists. When we say it, we should mean it. So, yeah.
Even walking around the office with our coworkers, right? Like, we should know better. If we see somebody be like, "Hey, man, what's up? Oh, it looks like you're going through something. We should get coffee. All right, see ya."
Yeah.
Right. And then you never get
Yeah, and then you never have a chance. And and you missed opportunities for really solid, great interactions with human, authentic people who, like, if you're willing to ask all of the questions and willing to hear all of the answers, it will change the dynamic of how you interact with people. It's a hard thing to do.
Sure.
It's an investment in time. It's an investment in breaking your schedule from being somewhere like super duper on time. Nobody will accuse me of that, but like, but the idea of like, I'd really love to know how you're doing, but I gotta go. I got 7-minute window where I can do the time thing. But being that being even in just like real friendships outside of therapy, which are real relationships, but it's different. The investment into somebody's life where you say, "No, really, how are you?" That makes it gives you a different experience with that person. You really know the person, but you also really experience what it's like for somebody to be vulnerable with you and to trust that you have that same freedom with them.
And how do we like cultivate spaces where we can do that? Like, I don't know. 3 years ago, I started a garden with my friends, and we would go to this community garden plot every single day. And I think it cultivated this space for us to just be authentic, because we'd come after work. We'd had long days, it was like 8 o'clock at night and it's hot and the sun's going down and somebody has to water the garden. But I think it just created this space for us to be, one, creative together, because we're just playing around in a garden and who knows what's going to grow and what's going to be eaten by deer. But like, two, like, we get to see each other at the end of the day and like check in about all of our days and check in about how everybody's doing and like how can we continue. Now, I'm not doing the garden this year, but how can we cultivate those spaces with the people that are most important in our lives so that we can have authentic conversations.
Yeah.
But I feel like those spaces where there is creativity breaks the rest of it loose
Yeah.
a little bit. Like, I can remember a client that I had once upon a time who, I think our first like 5 sessions were really painful as a therapist, and probably for her as well. Because I would be like, "Oh, how you doing?" And I meant it. I wanted to know. Good, I'm fine. Okay, so like, tell me about sort of what showed up for you. Not too much. Okay, so why the fuck are you here? Like, why are you here? Why are you here? And we had sort of this like really locked off relationship for a really long time. And then she said, "Can I bring in an activity to the next session at the end of another exceedingly painful session?" And I remember being like, "Sure, I'm down. Like, whatever you want to do, let's try it." And so she was with her church knitting mats made out of plastic bags for the homeless community. This was an activity that she was working on. So she had these huge, like, grocery sacks full of tied together grocery sacks, and she's knitting a giant mat for the homeless community. And as she's knitting, the words just start to flow. And like I'm just sitting there, like, and you know, like a cat, you don't want to scare them. Like it's like I don't want to get too enthusiastic, but like, you know, I'm kind of an emotional vampire. I'm like, yes, feelings, let's talk about them. But it was just that act of being able to be creative and like go through her rhythm at her pace, and it just unlocked all these different ways in which I suspect like this part of her brain was shutting down and tamping down the rest of her experience. And we ended up having a tremendously fruitful therapeutic relationship. But I think if it weren't for her saying, can I bring this in? I don't know that we ever would have gotten anywhere. And eventually she would have just stopped coming. I'm almost certain.
We used to have these community spaces. You know,
Yeah.
the idea of a sewing circle or a stitch and bitch or whatever, or, you know, working out in a wood shop or gardening or we had these spaces where we were doing other things that then freed up mental space to talk, because you don't even have to look at someone.
Right.
That's why I always have coloring stuff in my office. You don't have to look at someone if you're coloring. And our society doesn't organically have those spaces anymore.
I feel like our society actually tamps that down. Like as someone who was, you know, diagnosed, I think I was diagnosed with ADHD at 6. And so I've lived my whole life as somebody sort of on the grid, not neurotypical. And I was always like doodling and drawing and fidgeting but that was how I stayed present in the room. But then that's disrespectful. Put that down. Give me your eyes. And then I remember I'm listening to you. I'm not listening. I'm not here anymore. If I was allowed to doodle, I would still be here, but that's not respectful to you. So now I'm absent in my brain, but my eyes are on you, but there's nothing behind them. And so I think we as a culture almost tamp that down with a lot of different societal expectations that I don't think serves us long term.
Then you have to unlearn that when you're an adult. Like now do you doodle in your paper?
All the time.
Right. But you probably had to like unlearn how to do that because you were not allowed to do that when you were a kid.
I used to work with these groups of teen boys, and getting teen boys to talk about things like emotional things is really, really difficult. So and my experience with teen girls would be like, how was your day? And then they would just it would all, bleh. And fortunately, 2 daughters now, so that's good. But with teen boys, it's a lot trickier. So I'd be like, I wouldn't talk about whatever we were going to talk about. I'm like, we're going to have an airplane contest. Give like 4 or 5 sheets of paper. And then I would just ask real subtle questions. And those guys would give up some of the deepest emotional content because they didn't have to look at anybody in the face. They were so focused on what the thing was that the stuff would just drip out of them. I find that that's interesting about campfires too. Like I worked at camps for 100 years, and like the most meaningful conversations that we would have as like guys would be every dude is staring at the fire just like mesmerized like cavemen. And then the deepest things would come out because they didn't have to look at somebody directly in the eye. They could focus on like the color and whatever was happening with them, but also the aspect of just like being able to say all the brutal things out loud and to know that it was almost a sacred space where like on it. And the next day, nobody like talked about it. You know what I mean? Nobody like,
This really
hey, did you hear blah, 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 blah. It was just like, there was like catharsis. Everybody slept great. You didn't have to worry about dudes sneaking out at night, you know? And so it was like just a moment of like brutal honesty. Sometimes kids would confront each other about a real thing and like hard stuff. And then they'd just like work it out. And where they would not typically do that in a setting where like, they had to like look at each other and talk to each other and like make eye contact and a lot of times like that stuff like your teacher, go ahead, no, look up here, pay attention. Yeah.
And there's no product at the end of that. So I'm thinking about like the creative space around the campfire where you don't have to talk about it the next day.
Yeah.
Like if we're making art, if we're writing things, if we're doing stuff, that process might be great, but then here's this thing that symbolizes that. And sometimes that's good. like your case with the mask, that ability to kind of like put that thing away. And sometimes it's a problem though, in that, okay, here is this reminder. I think couples counseling, I always set a rule for text messages that it's, how are you, not how are you, excuse me, where's the kid's shoes? What time are you going to be home? Can you get milk? Anything emotionally laden? Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Because then you can actually, it's like you're reliving the argument every time you look at it. So sometimes in a creative space, you need that product at the end. And sometimes you need to not have a product. So you just think about like the feelings. I use sand to do like sand mandalas sometimes. And then you wipe the sand away so that you remember the process, but you don't then sit and like look at this thing that you made.
That's like, again, teenage boys are super creative with fire,
Oh.
but at the end, it's all burnt,
Yeah.
right? Like, so like they make this giant tower of log cabin fire and the teepee fire and all, and then at the end they're just like, oh, that it's done, and you don't have to revisit it.
Kids have a natural desire, and we all have a natural desire to want to burn stuff. I think, you know, like put anyone around it. But then, like using that, like, one of the things
Yeah.
I miss about family base is that ability. We're gonna write this letter and we're gonna burn it. Like that's your stereotypical one, but destruction is creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
There you go. That's the podcast theme. Teacher kids about fires. No.
I would say again, as not the devil's advocate, but I do also believe in eye contact as well.
For sure.
And like that whole, I'm not saying anybody was saying no eye contact ever, but there are moments where there's nothing more difficult or uncomfortable than to look somebody in the eye.
Yeah.
And having the ability, the concept of if you don't use it, you lose it. So I was a lead crisis de-escalator. When I worked at PPI, I would have a beeper. It would go off. It would tell me what floor I had to go to, and I would show up to someone agitated, possibly violent. And no matter how scared I was, I'm positive that being able to look at them, even if it was to recognize they didn't want me to look at them, in which case I would no longer look at them. Being able to do it despite it being my natural desire or my natural urge, or looking down being my natural defense mechanism. Just being able to do it despite what came most naturally was a very powerful tool in communication, in the building of rapport, and all things therapeutic. So I agree that I don't want your eyes if your brain isn't there, but just that everything always comes that kind of to a balance.
Yeah, for sure.
We need to be able to be our authentic selves, and we also need to be able to offer A, B, or C, which might not come naturally, but it's like socially fair to all parties involved, and learning how to do some of those skills that aren't necessarily the most comfortable.
Yeah.
That whole balance. I don't know what age you teach it. Again, like I don't know if you should expect a 5-year-old to not doodle, but just conceptually, it's good to be allowed to be in a space where you can retrieve information clearly, and also be allowed to let who's ever delivering that information know that you're receiving it. It's like a give and take.
It's like distress tolerance, right?
Distress tolerance.
for
Yeah,
sure.
I'm huge on distress tolerance. I think that's a big big part of what saved my life.
Because whatever you can learn to deal with, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I think we use humor to teach those skills, even
Sure.
young. My son is in a D's nuts and your mom phase.
Oh,
No matter what you
great.
say, it's
D's
D's
nuts.
nuts.
These nuts, yeah,
Or
we've
your
got
mom.
that's
And
in
I
our home as
can't
well.
believe
right
those are
now.
still around.
Oh yeah, these nuts.
That's awesome.
But you know, we're starting to teach that social skills of I will actually set him up to make those jokes sometimes to give him that space, but then be like, that was funny. Remind me why you don't say that at school again. You know, so it's like we can actually set up that moment for a kid to be creative, or an adult like, okay, this is an appropriate coping skill here,
Right.
but not here.
Right.
And doing that in a creative, same with eye contact.
Yeah.
You know, if I have a kid, just look at me long enough that I know you heard me say it. Okay, now you can look away. Like giving those little bits and teaching them, you know, you get your kid not to swear at all, great. Let me know how you did that. But helping him to understand that there's certain places, maybe, like we can use that humor and creativity and their own sense of humor to learn
Absolutely.
that social discretion,
Yeah.
maybe.
That's a good social discretion. Yeah.
Context matters, and I think that we don't give that enough like my oldest looked at me the other day and he goes, Mom, can I curse? And I said, well, what are the rules for cursing? We don't do it at school. We don't do it around other kids. I can do it with you. I was like, well, then what's the rule? He's like, then I can curse. And it's like, yes.
I always want to know the next part of that. Like, what did he say?
Oh, he said,
I need to know what he brought after
he
that.
said, Mom, I am damn happy you switched my school. And I was like, that's a effective use of curse words.
Yeah.
I'm proud of you.
I love it when kids are learning, they misconjugate just a little bit.
Oh no, not my 8-year-old. No. He chef's kiss. He got it just right. But I think that we don't often create space like for those creative expression or for those different. And then I think as we get older, those concerns about like value judgments come in, and that fear. And I went years ago to a week-long intensive. It's actually an inpatient facility. It's part of the Karen Foundation, so it's called the Breakthrough Program.
I did that.
Did you?
did.
I loved the Breakthrough
Me too.
Program. Who was your therapist?
I can't remember.
Was it a guy that looked like Penn Jillette?
From Penn and Teller?
No,
Yes.
no. There's a guy he was shorter.
Okay. No, my was Randy. Was the big guy.
Oh, it was Randy. He's not tall.
But he looks like Penn Jillette. He's got like the
He
dark
does.
hair.
It was
I don't know.
Randy for sure.
Anywho, at the Karen Foundation, did you end on a drum circle
No.
at yours?
It
So
was
mine.
like COVID-y, so there wasn't it was only like 6 of us. But it was deeper than
It was deep.
I wanted to go.
It was
Yeah.
deeper than you want. But they use the psychodrama there.
Yes.
And it is such an intense. I mean, I remember after day 1, and I don't think I did my psychodrama until like day 4, because of course I'm like, every time they're like, whose turn is it? Like not making eye contact. And so I didn't do mine until day 4. I wept so hard for days 1 through 3 that I went to bed with a headache every night just from like ugly crying at other people's psychodramas.
And having to wash off the stuff
wash
at
off.
the end of who you were, the role that you played for someone else.
Yes. But also it brought up stuff in you because you were that role likely at different points in time, maybe not the same way, maybe not in the way in which this person experienced, but like we've all played roles that we're not proud of. We've all hurt people. So I think it does take you into contact with some things that are really quite painful. And then at the end, we had this drum circle, and it's such this, like the experience was so, at least for me, quite profound, and just a lot of places in which I was quite stuck. I felt very unstuck by the end. And then we sit down to have a drum circle, and immediately the narrative I tell myself is I'm not musically inclined. This isn't for me. And so again, like I try to sit back. I try to stay away from it. And Penn Jillette comes up and he's like, no, we're going to do this. Let's do the thing. And I remember like weeping because I was so embarrassed by how bad I was and so disconnected from it. And then I think afterwards worked through that whole process and went and bought a djembe. Like at the end of it, I was like, I love drum circles. But I think it's just interesting, like the stories we tell ourselves about our identities and who we are and what we hold really tightly, and then how that impedes our ability to get the most out of something. And once we let that go, we buy a djembe.
Yeah.
I love that idea of like literally of washing things off of you. I went through something fairly traumatic and difficult when I was in college. And as I was trying to heal from it, I got a trusted friend, and I actually took a washable crayon and wrote all over my arms some of the labels I gave myself after this experience, and then washed them off. And that was just such like a literal cleansing, those rituals that you hear about. And we can do smaller versions of that with our kids. When I see kids who are writing all over themselves, especially if they're writing like curse words or things like that, it's like, okay, it's an interesting discussion. Like, why are you marking your body with that? And maybe we can wash it off, or like, let's talk about what this looks like. Or led to an interesting discussion with a teenager once about something you think's going to wash off, but doesn't, no matter what you do, and you just have to give it time. That was after a hair dye incident, I believe, that she had, if I remember correctly. That idea, sometimes you think it'll wash off and it won't. So, like, you can take those ideas and you can make them real
Yeah.
and deal with them.
Well, I was going to say, going back to the psychodrama, just the idea of drama, you had talked earlier about people on one side of the line or the other. I think drama is one of the most perfect mediums where you can have an audience full of people who all have different lived experiences, and more than one of them will relate to the same character, or they'll see someone they know in the same character. And I think that that's just a really powerful tool, because then you, and that's what I'm trying to do with the musical I was referring to earlier, is you can have someone with a mental health diagnosis and someone without it, and they're both going to relate to the same person because it's human. And that's the beauty of art, and I think especially drama, where you can see it play out. And like you said, I was that person, I am that person, I know people who've been that person.
And I will be that
I
person
might be
again,
that person.
no matter how much I
Yes.
hate that
Someone
person
may
right
see
now.
me as that
Yeah.
person, all of those different thoughts that everybody who's watching it is also thinking. So then, like, small discussion groups after experiences like that are rich with people coming together, even though their lives are different and they're each individual. We also use acting at the college level with nursing students, where I will become someone who is escalating, and it will be their job to de-escalate me in a simulations lab. And that they learn preconceived notions, they learn different tics they may have. Do they laugh when they're uncomfortable? Do they try to control to the situation? Do they disappear when they get frightened? It never becomes physical, but it's just high energy confrontation. And the amount of discussions that are had after those experiences and what those students learn about themselves before entering the workforce is something that I'm trying to do with teachers and future police officers, and kind of take this idea of using improvisational drama to help people learn how to handle really difficult situations prior to entering them.
But that's something we shy away from. You and I just had this conversation about role play in the therapy space, and how much role play is a powerful tool, and how much no one wants to do it. If you call it improv or something, it's basically what it is. Therapists don't like it, clients don't like
Right.
it, but my physical therapist always says, if it's uncomfortable, you're growing. If it's painful, you need to stop.
Yeah, that's great.
So like with if the role play is uncomfortable, that's probably a good thing.
They're allowed to put their hands up and be like, this is over and we'll start debriefing sooner. But the concept is, this is what you are walking out into. And for years, I felt like I knew so much more, or I had to practice so much more of what we said was appropriate mental health practices as a sick person, because I was in inpatient facilities and I was in all these places. And then I would be released back into the community and nobody else knew any of that stuff. For example, like assertive communication, you get taught, be more assertive, set your boundaries. And you start doing that with people who have never learned about assertive communication, and it's aggressive.
Yeah.
So the idea is that we take this information and we start having everybody understand it to a degree, especially in human services. You can do a little introspection. You can understand yourself. You can understand yourself when you're frightened. You can understand yourself when you're frustrated. You can understand yourself when you feel insecure. And by understanding those things prior to them happening in real time, you have a better opportunity to handle them safely for you and for the other people involved.
I think that's a great thing to know about, like in the context of working with a partner too, because like if a topic comes up that rings my bell in a way that's not helpful, I really like it when my partner is aware of that, so I can be like, hey, so this comes up from time to time.
Right.
I'm gonna leave, so I need you to know why it's happening, and just that self-awareness that. Because in the first like 6 months of like doing it, I was like, why am I so uncomfortable right now? Like, what is happening? This session isn't a big deal. And then like just developing a little bit different level of self-awareness.
Yes.
And understanding of like, oh, this is a thing for me. I need to like find a way to, and again, that's when the creative art thing happens, right? So
Yeah.
I'll go out and like catch my breath in a way, or like think about something creative that makes me feel freer. And then, or I'll carve in some sessions. I'll carve a little piece of wood. I don't recommend that for working with people who self-harm, but like it creates the moment where it's I'm able to regulate. they're able to see a calming thing happen. And sometimes they're like, what are you doing? Like, I thought we're doing this thing. And I'm like, well, we are. Like, you don't know that we're doing this thing, but we are actually. This is the thing that we're doing. And it makes me find the spot where I know that, like, I have to be aware of those things. If I respond, if I've had a million jobs where I've got punched in the face by kids, and it's not great. I don't love it. And the idea of, like, knowing when I'm afraid of, like, a little kid, and just the idea of, like, we're gonna have a hard conversation. You're gonna punch me in the face, like, and I freak out a little bit, right? But, like, knowing that, like, if I'm calm and they freak out a little bit, there's a pretty good chance they'll calm down too.
Co-regulation.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
I've been in the building I'm in for 13 years, and I think I've been in my office for 9 of those years, maybe a little longer. I got offered a slightly bigger office, and I was like, I'm not moving all my stuff. But my office is absolutely set up with things that make me feel comfortable. Whether it's sensory-wise or sounds or music, I never turn on the overhead lights, ever, ever. And, I've got music that I like and all those things. Those creative outlets, my office is like an extension of myself, and using creativity to make that a safe place for me allows it to be a safe place for my clients. And that's, I think, one of the reasons I didn't make it as a family-based therapist is all I ever had to go back to was my car. And, like, I have that space where I close my door and I have my lights off and I have music on, and it's like being in my own safe space, for lack of a better word. So we use that creativity to, when we keep ourselves safe, we can keep our clients safe.
So we always accept questions for the How to Be Happy Hour. And so we've had quite a few submitted for today, actually. If you happen to have questions for us, it's kim@howtobehappyhour.com. And we have a couple upcoming topics. So we have one coming up on social media. We have one coming up on advocacy and how to create policy change. I think those are the next 2 big topics. So shoot us an email with any of those questions if you have them. But one of the questions that was submitted here today that I thought was interesting is that have y'all observed any differences in the effectiveness of creative expression as a therapeutic tool across different age groups or individuals from different cultural backgrounds? Have you noticed any themes in your creative expression across clients?
I feel like it's harder to get adults to be creative in therapy, and when you ask them to, they're like my office is very child-centered. I have a lot of toys, so when I try very hard to also make it a little adult appropriate, but I just did a kid intervention with an adult the other day, and at first she was like, I'm not creative, and I was like, it doesn't matter, and as she did it turned out really beautifully, and it was really cool and implemented. But I've noticed that hesitation between adults and kids, where a kid, you ask them to do it and they're like, all right, cool. And then an adult, they're like, I don't know
Tell me
about this.
more.
And why would I do that? There's a lot of toys there. I don't think I'm supposed to do that.
I had a similar experience with a guy that was like a stepdad in a new situation. Also had like legal issues, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna try this thing where we do a couple handed drawings, and it's gonna be weird. And a lot of the guys I worked with would have been like, no, but the joining thing, the humanity thing, allowed him to be like, this is weird as frick, Don, but I'll give it a whirl. I trust you. This is weird, but let's do it. And it was helpful. And I like that you said that you're taking the risk of trying it with adults and having them like buy in. That's cool.
And if they trust you, I think that's an important piece too. Like if you've gotten joining with them and they're like, okay, if you say so, and then you confidently do it too.
Yeah.
I think then they're like, okay, yeah, cool, I'll do it.
Yeah.
I think the biggest difference for me with adults is I'm much more explicit about the idea of consent. So like with a kid, if we're doing an art activity, they'll just be like, I'm done, and they'll push it away. With an adult, if I'm doing art or music, I actually have to spell out, hey, if you decide you don't want to do this, please tell me you don't want to do it anymore, or tell me you don't want to do this. Like, and if they don't, we'll explore, like, do you not want to, that uncomfortable versus painful piece.
Yeah.
But you don't need to do that with kids as much, because they'll just go, I'm done.
Right.
And so I
They
think
will let you know.
with adults, I have to explain that consent piece when we do the creative exercise a little bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like one of the EMDR exercises, stop means stop, and you practice with them shutting you down as they tell their trauma narrative. And like so often, we'll have clients come in that are like good clients, like they're going to do the things and say the words, and I'll do what you tell me to do. But then at the end of the day, they don't feel agency or a sense of not self-control, but they don't feel as though they are the ones.
Self-determination.
Yeah, it feels like you're robbing them of that consent piece. So it's interesting. I think especially in the creative arts, that's a good. But I've had some clients like really get into the creative stuff. Like one of my favorite things to do is a genogram with found objects around the home. And so like I just wrapped up working with a couple, and I said, hey, go around your house and grab things that represent the people in your family and bring it back. And we're going to create a genogram together. And like, they got hilarious with it. They got real creative. They brought back like a rubber snake for a grandma that we don't talk to anymore, like all the things. But through that, we also found like we identified some really cool intergenerational patterns. We were able to identify some parts of their narrative that were impeding their relationship in the dyad and all sorts of different things. So I feel like it's real bimodal with adults. Like sometimes adults are like, fuck yeah, let's do something creative. Or they're like, what do you mean? But I don't think there's much in between those two extremes.
The only other thing I can think about for different age groups and stuff is just the humor to me about the music in nursing homes and what it used to be and what it is now and what it'll be when we are there. You know, like you know.
Like I remember growing up and hearing oldies stations, and they were like from the 50s, and now oldies stations are songs from when I was a kid, and I'm like, I'm not that old yet. But,
Classic rock is the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
yeah.
Like, wait a
what in the
minute.
world?
Nirvana.
Oh my goodness.
So
The other question that I have, or that was submitted, but I have here is, are there any misconceptions or myths surrounding the relationship between creative expression and recovery that you would like to address?
Yes. I just don't think it's all. I believe that there is a risk, as with anything else, that it can. I spoke earlier. I used the word trap, but I just believe that. And I'm not a negative person. I believe in creativity wholeheartedly. But when it comes to recovery, there are other steps that require taking, even beyond coping. So, you find this coping skill. It's creative. It helps you possibly move through, not just avoid, but it's all you're able to do. And in one way, that's great because you are working through your trauma. You are keeping yourself afloat, whatever phrase you would like to use. But in another way, if there are still these other steps that may require taking in order to try to maximize your potential as and assimilate into your society, then it's more than just that. And I can speak from personal experience. I also know that there were a number of times where my creative drive was solely associated with marijuana. So in order to create, I needed to get high. So now I'm a bipolar person who is also a creative, and I was functioning. I had appropriate jobs. I was working at a paid-your-own pottery studio. I was doing professional theater and getting paid for. I was doing all these things, but I needed to get high every time to do anything creative. So then you bring in that substance use, and is that addiction? Is that disorder? Is that my process? There's all these different ways somebody can explain it, but I do notice often when hearing creatives, even famous ones, discuss their process, that oftentimes drugs are involved. And I'm not even saying yes or no, right or wrong. I'm not trying to have an opinion on it, but for people who are trying to recover, if that is a piece of your creative process, it's hard to continue to create and try to remove that aspect of your life. I've learned.
I think it's less of a myth and more just of a misconception. No intervention is without risk.
Yeah.
You think about something that I used to consider pretty benign, make a musical timeline of your life. You know, go home, instead of telling me words, find songs that represent different points in your life. And I had someone be extremely triggered by a song that they came up with. Music especially is processed by so many different areas of the brain. There's a viral video, I think it was about 2 years ago, of an elderly woman who used to be a dancer, and she's listening to Swan Lake, and she's going through all the arm movements as if she's reliving that moment of dancing that ballet. And that certain songs, certain things can almost cause a person to relive that experience. And so something that seems very, very safe and benign can really open a door. So I still do that musical timeline, but I never send clients home to do it anymore. I do it with them in the moment. We look up music on YouTube and stuff to find the songs in case we open that door.
Well, how often? I mean, I can just think of in my own life and lived experience, like Apple Music is like, you love this song, but like not right now, Apple Music.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't want to go there in this moment. Like, warn somebody before we play like the worst day since yesterday. Like, I need a minute. And I think that's I think music does a beautiful job of allowing us to experience the feelings we need to experience. But I think it also can just like reach out and slap you in the teeth. And sometimes that's helpful, right? Like sometimes
Sometimes it's the same song.
And sometimes
Like,
it's the same song.
I can experience Mama Said Knock You Out by LL Cool J 2 very different ways. You know, like sometimes I'm like, oh, yeah. And other times I'm like, ooh, no thanks. You know, and there's power in that for sure.
At the same time, we can also build new triggers. I have my ADHD guys, I have make a playlist for when they're studying. I was like, if you listen to this music every time you're studying, your brain will associate this music with studying. Therefore, your brain will automatically kind of go to study mode when you're listening to this. You know, so it can be, we don't realize how much it's influencing us, and to just be aware of that.
I would go back one more time to what I said earlier, where when you create something, if it is to a degree dependent on how it's received, it can induce stress versus reduce it. So I'm not going to repeat the whole thing again, but I would also say that answers the question, where if your art becomes dependent on how it's received and how many likes or how many clicks or all the different things that would validate you or be the reinforcement you're seeking, then it can shift from a coping mechanism to a trigger.
If you do an art notebook or a journal or something like that in therapy, making sure, especially with teenagers, like, this is theirs. They don't have to share it, you know, and they don't even have to share it with me if they don't want to. But the moment that you take a journal like that and a well-intentioned parent goes, I want to see what they're thinking.
Oh, yeah.
And out come like this vile something about how they hate their stepdad or something, but it's out of context, and now that safe space isn't safe anymore. So if we're going to be creating in therapy, I think it's something I hadn't really considered up front. Is this something we are sharing, or is this something that is private?
That's a good idea.
Yeah, that's part of the consent piece too. At the beginning, like at the end of the day, and also like, how do you record keep that? Like, do you keep it and put it in your file, or like give it to them when they're done? Like, I think that's probably the best way, unless it's something that is like they're done with, you know?
When I was a teenager, I did a couple different art therapies as part of my inpatient treatment. One time I put a hole in my tree, and the therapist told me which one of your parents sexually abused you. And I just put the hole in the tree because I wanted to put an owl in there, you know? So that's one piece where the trust can get broken, is in the interpretation. But I've also had art depicting myself in suicidal acts and things like that, and I don't know where the line is. You're asking me to express myself, so here's this drawing that I'm creating, and I have some of those pictures still, and I look at them and I think, if someone saw this in my notebook, I'd probably get 302'd, or maybe my meds would have gotten increased, or or who knows what, because you don't just draw when you're a kid. I mean, I had a drawing notebook when I was in my early 20s, but I see some of those pictures or I look at them with my wife, and it's what is expression and then what causes concern, and that involves the professional, and the professional feels that they need to make a decision, then all of a sudden it's out of your hands and you were just trying to express yourself through art. So there's just this big space where decisions can be made, and how much do you want someone to truly authentically express what they're feeling versus how much can you receive, how much can you handle without believing they need help.
Yeah, can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Absolutely.
Does that ever limit your creativity? Like where you get to the part where you're making something, even if it's just for you.
Yeah.
And there's that spot where you're like, I don't know if this is the thing. Or like if you're writing
100%.
or if you're writing a story about a character who's really terrible.
Yes.
And you're like, oh my gosh, people are going to think that's me.
Yes, 100%. As someone who's trying to be a public figure to a degree, and be invited into schools and be invited into places where there's going to be a lot of standards, I constantly restrict my language, my concepts. I try, if they're serious concepts, I try to really surround them with creative symbolism and things like that. Because for me, it's more about my message and the message being received. So if I have to do A, B, or C so that I'm allowed to be invited into these places where I believe it's most important that I'm supposed to deliver these messages, then I will. And that does probably restrict my true, authentic, artistic self.
Yeah.
But that's intentional and somewhat strategic, because I have a desire to not step on anybody's toes, because for me, the message is more important than any single piece of art.
Gotcha. Does it keep you from doing stuff you want to do, though?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Until you're famous or whatever you call it, one wrong move, one wrong line, one misperceived anything,
One tweet from
and
30
you're
years
done.
ago.
You're done.
Yeah.
And that's not, I'm not trying to be political, but because you're a nobody, then all the momentum you have can be lost immediately.
Right.
Once you get to a certain point of social influence, you can do or say whatever you want, and even if you get criticized, you're safe.
Dave Chappelle.
Hey, I'm not in that position. I was on disability for 3 years. My liver was shutting down from years of medication. I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel. So as someone who's trying to be influential in my community, I'm towing every single line that I believe I need to in order to keep finding more and more opportunities.
Right.
And it's been working. But is it my authentic artistic self? Absolutely not.
Okay.
And thinking about the idea of nothing about us without us, which I'm very big on, then you look at people who get so stuck in their creative vision that they miss the point. And I'm going back to Sia's movie Music,
Okay.
which is a lot of controversy about that and how it depicts autism. So it's also like there has to be that space to hear voices that are different than yours too. Like that's why creative is so hard.
Correct.
Like she stuck to a vision. A lot of people didn't like that vision.
Right.
And so what is the point? At what point do you listen and do you shift a little bit if you're trying to put something out there to get a point across to the public?
And that's what my message is more important than my method at this point. So I've written 3 books. Every time one book comes out, you hear what people like and what they don't like. I don't mind adapting it, and then I'll adapt it again. I'll keep adapting it if it means it's possible that the content will be received, because ultimately that's what I believe I'm here to do. That's why I believe I've gone through what I've gone through. These are the things that help me get through life on a daily basis. So I'm not going to ever be staunch on a delivery method, but I won't change the message that I believe I'm trying to get across.
Makes me think of how often we're working with an individual in some sort of creative methodology, and they self-edit out of fear of how it will be perceived. And I mean, I've been in those rooms where the parents really worked up and they bring in the notebook of the child's drawings or poetry or photography, and they're like, this is really bad. And it's like, well, I mean, at least they're expressing it. And I don't know. I mean, truly, where's the line between like drawing images of self-harm and then engaging in self-harm? where I sit, I prefer drawing images of it versus engaging in it. I don't know how many images one must draw before they do the thing. I don't know that anyone knows. I imagine that that's probably pretty different for everybody. And so,
Or it keeps them from the thing.
or it keeps them from the thing. And that's the other piece to that. Like, I remember growing up, like, I listened to a bunch of like really dark music because that was my thing. And I remember my mom being like, I'm going to take I was of the Marilyn Manson era, right? And my mom's like, you can't listen to Marilyn Manson. That's making kids do school shootings. And it's like, well, Ma, is that the reason? I'm going to go with probably not. But so often, like, we take our creative expression literally. And then it robs you, like, similar to doing it for the likes or doing it for the accolades. I think when it's literalized and then kind of like, oh, this is a risk factor. It's like, well, at least they're drawing it.
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
I would love to get parents on board with the idea of their kids' musical and digital intake as being more like a diet. You don't want your kid listening to Marilyn Manson all day, every day, just like you don't want them eating cake all day, every day. But sometimes it makes sense to have those things, you know, and we give our kid a lollipop after they get through, you know, getting a shot at the doctor. You know, that doesn't mean we don't want to teach, now they're going to want lollipops every time they do something hard. No, so certain music to get through
So
certain
what if they do?
things. Yeah,
Like, what's the worst thing? That they get a lollipop every time they do something cool? Like, there's a lot worse ways to cope, right? So what if they do?
I generated something called the mood pyramid, which took the idea of the food pyramid, but I put emotional needs in there and talked about too much, too little. But it was a well-balanced feel instead of a well-balanced
that.
meal. So when I hear you talk about consumption, I agree that there are certain things we just need to manage our consumption of versus cutting any of them completely out, just like we do with food.
I love me some true crime podcasts and stuff, but not the weeks my husband is traveling. You know,
right.
It's recognizing again what do we consume. It's not just about creating art. What art do we choose to consume? And the internet, video games, all that stuff. It's art. It's creative. We're consuming it instead of creating it. But again, it's within a balance.
Right.
Kids playing Fortnite will not make them school shooters. Kids doing nothing but playing Fortnite all day, every day is going to be a problem.
Thank y'all for this very engaging conversation. Is there anything left unsaid before we wrap?
I think we said all of it.
I wanted to say really quick that I heard all of you as a practitioner still use the phrase create space.
Yeah.
I just want to say that the word create is in that phrase. So there's even creativity in your ability to create whatever spaces you need to create each time you do it. And it's something to think about for as many of us who might not think we're creative. Every time you have a session, you are creating a space, you are adapting and adjusting to whatever's occurring. And I just believe that there's a lot of creativity in that.
No, I like that. I think that's a good sort of way to wrap. That there in psychotherapy, regardless if you're using creative modalities or not, you're using creativity.
Absolutely.
And I think so often people like me will say, well, I'm not creative, I'm not musical, I'm not artistic. But I think you're right, that's to be a psychotherapist, you are creative in every session.
Yes.
Even when you don't have any paint. Well, thank you so much. This was the How to Be Happy Hour. In terms of our upcoming topics, we have two big ones coming down the line. One is looking at social media. The other is looking at advocacy and how we create change. So we thank you for listening and hope you have a great day.